Hello, everybody. I hope that you are all well and having a happy Earth Week. Um, Today, the plan is to run through a very quick review of Unit 2, which is about biodiversity. And then I have a Kahoot for you to do. On the Kahoot, very important, please make sure that you're using your real name or your, what I know you as, so I can give you points. And then we have a little bit of FRQ practice. It's not like an entire FRQ, just a little bit to get us going. I want to remind you that the College Board has sent out an email asking, I think, if you're going to take the exam. Please make sure to respond to that. Also, on the College Board or Advanced Placement YouTube channel, there are APES reviews being posted every day. They are all about 45 minutes long. They seem decent. I encourage you to check them out if you're looking for a more in-depth video review. Our video review today is just going to be super quick. So this is not going super in-depth. It's just to remind you, like, hey, we talked about these things. So with that, let's get started. So talking about biodiversity, the topics that were covered were the levels of biodiversity, ecosystem services, island biogeography, ecological tolerance, ecosystem response to disturbance and succession, and organisms' response to their environment. So starting out with biodiversity, remember we talked about 3 major kinds. Your book talks about 4, but the ones that the AP exam will focus on are genetic, species, and habitat. So genetic biodiversity, remember, is just that we have a diversity of genes within our species. So within the human species, you can see a bunch of different alleles. With species diversity, that just means, so this one would be genetic, sorry. Species, that just means that there's a bunch of different species on Earth or a bunch of different species in an ecosystem. And habitat means that there's a bunch of different kinds of habitats in an area. Remember, ecosystems that are highly diverse are more resilient to change because there are more genes or species or habitats to take the place of ones that might be impacted by an ecological disturbance. So, moving on to resistance and resilience. So I just said species or ecosystems that are more diverse are more resilient to change. So remember, resistance just means the ability of an ecosystem to remain mostly unchanged due to a disturbance. So this first graph here shows us resistance. So you can be applying stress to an ecosystem, and a resistant ecosystem I have a hard time describing this without saying the word resist, will not change as a response to that stress until it gets to a certain point, and then you see very rapid change. With resilience, so resilience is the ability of an ecosystem to return to like a normal after a disturbance. So resilient ecosystems are super important because they can bounce back after a disturbance. So a disturbance can be anything from like a wildfire to a storm to anthropogenic climate change. Any of those things are like disturbances, and resilient ecosystems are more likely to respond and bounce back to continue to thrive. Okay, moving on to generalist and specialist species. So, generalist, remember, is something that can live in a wide variety of environments and eat a wide variety of foods. So, our raccoon is our classic generalist species, and our specialist species is a species that lives in a specific environment, eats a specific diet. So, pandas are the classic specialist species. Remember, generalists are more likely to be adaptable to change because they can thrive in many different situations. Okay, species richness and evenness. So with species richness, sorry. I thought I had it. I do. With species richness, this is the number of species in an ecosystem. So that's like your N, like the little N, number of species in the ecosystem. And then evenness is the relative abundance. So an I am so sorry. An ecosystem that is highly rich with species would have a bunch of different species. An ecosystem that is highly even, you would have like relatively the same number of each species. So species richness and species evenness both go into calculating biodiversity. So ideally you want an ecosystem that is rich and even. In our pictures here, community 1 has a higher species richness because it has a greater number of species, whereas community 2 has a higher relative abundance. I wouldn't say community 2 is even, but it is, like, species A is definitely prevalent in community 2. Ooh, ecosystem services. Okay, this one we did not talk a ton about, but just know that ecosystems can provide, or do provide services to humans. So it's 4 categories. You have provisioning services. So these are products that are obtained from ecosystems. So I always think about it as like provisions. So energy, seafood, biomedical, so like getting medicines out of rainforests, transportation, national defense, all of these things can be ecosystem services, provisioning services. Regulating services mean things that help keep the earth livable, right? Benefits obtained from regulation of ecosystem processes. So flood prevention, climate regulation, erosion control, control of pests and pathogens, so things that help keep our ecosystems happy and keep our lives happy here. Cultural services are non-material benefits obtained from ecosystems, so this is like a beautiful vista, or we can go out into nature and be educated, or we can go hiking, or heritage or spiritual aspects of nature. And then supporting services are services necessary for production of all other ecosystem services. So this would be biological diversity maintenance, nutrient recycling, primary productivity. All of these things help the ecosystem run and provide us with all those other services. Okay, island biogeography. So do you remember when we taped the island on the floor and you guys threw things all over the classroom and there were like nuts and bolts everywhere and cotton balls? Island biogeography. So if you remember that, the large island that was closest to the mainland ended up being the most biodiverse, and the small island that is far from the mainland is usually the least biodiverse. This is important when we're talking about preserving habitats. So this is why we want to preserve large swaths of connected habitats that have like less edge. So rather than having a bunch of little habitats, we want to try to protect one big habitat, or we want to try to connect those little habitats, because you can see those like islands of protected habitat as biodiversity hotspots, and so the large habitat would be the one that would be the most biodiverse. Okay, tolerance. So tolerance means that there is a range of abiotic conditions in which a species can live. So there's the preferred niche, which is in the middle, the optimum range, and then there's the marginal niche. So that's like outside of the preferred niche where it can exist. And then there's unavailable niche, so that would be like areas that it cannot exist. So if it is a specialist species, its range of tolerance would be narrower. And if it is a generalist species, its range of tolerance would be wider. This can be many things. It can be temperature, it can be pH, it can be amount of sunlight. So anything that impacts whether a species can live there or not. Okay, primary secondary succession. Remember, primary succession happens when there is a disturbance that removes topsoil. So that primary succession, you start out with lichens and fungus and mosses, and then you get grasses and shrubs, and then small trees and bigger trees. So primary succession takes a long time because there is no topsoil. Secondary succession, let's say there's a wildfire and you still have topsoil, you would go through secondary succession, so you end up starting with like grasses and then bushes and then small trees and then big trees. Secondary succession is a lot faster. Okay, and the last one, organisms versus change. So remember, when organisms are faced with change, they will either adapt and survive or they die. And those individuals that adapt, that have adaptations that make it more likely for them to be successful and survive and reproduce, over time that population can evolve. So individuals adapt, individuals have adaptations that can be beneficial to reproduction, populations are what end up evolving. This is a very quick overview of the topics of Unit 2. This is not comprehensive by any means. I will post the topics that are covered. They're on that first slide. I'll just post the slides. So make sure that you review these things. There is a Kahoot to help you review, and then we're going to write a little bit of an FRQ to also help review. I hope that you guys are all doing well. I miss you all. Oh man, I miss you guys. So email me, come to office hours 1 to 2 every day. I'm looking forward to seeing you. Bye.